Por 2 minutos mesmo só? Então pode deixar um lá.
Aqui no Mística, somos movidos por convicções, fortes valores, paixão por educar e gerar ideias capazes de provocar mudança.
Vídeo de som, tem que passar assim.
Buscamos formar novos líderes, pessoas capazes de inovar e empreender.
E com o nosso programa de bolsas, atraímos jovens talentos independentemente da condição econômica.
Atuamos em graduação, pós-graduação e educação executiva.
No começo, bem no começo, eram os MBAs. Depois veio a graduação.
Os de administração e economia e agora as engenharias.
São áreas de conhecimento que se complementam.
Nosso portfólio inclui os certificates, os programas de LLM e os mestrados profissionais.
E também doutorado, que explora a interface entre a economia e o ambiente de negócios.
Nossos alunos são preparados para enfrentar dilemas éticos, entender, respeitar
E conviver num contexto multicultural e complexo.
O aluno do Insta não se contenta em ficar sentado ouvindo.
Ele tem que se engajar no processo de aprendizado, sair da zona de conforto.
Pensar, discutir e não ter medo de errar.
E com isso, criar um ambiente de inovação e empreendedorismo.
Investimos no avanço do conhecimento.
E, por isso, incentivamos a pesquisa que impacte a sociedade e as empresas.
Publicações relevantes, muitas em coautoria com acadêmicos de outras escolas, nacionais e internacionais. E o mais importante é aproveitar tudo que a escola oferece.
Somos uma instituição com vocação para a evoluir, não se acomodar. Olhamos não só para o Brasil, queremos estar entre as melhores do mundo.
Okay, everyone. Thanks very much for attending the seminar. Today we have a presentation about the impact of the current crisis on poverty in Brazil. And so we have a presentation by Emmanuel Skoufias from the World Bank. He has a PhD in economics from Minnesota and is the chief economist on the poverty reduction group in the World Bank. So thank you very much for coming to INSPIR, Emmanuel. It's a pleasure. We have to discuss this important issue now. And then we'll have comments by Ricardo Paes Barros. So welcome everyone to this seminar. And this is being broadcast live to the internet. And so we thought about 45 minutes presenting. We can have some clarification questions along the way. And then Pepe will comment. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and present this work here. It's, my name appears here, but it's a collaboration of many people. So all the hard questions should be directed to them. I will try to answer them. Let's see how we go down the next page. What we can do here. So I think you're all aware. You're experiencing that every day. Brazil is in the midst of a deep recession. These numbers came out from IBGE last Tuesday. The economy contracted by 3.6% in 2016. Unemployment is up to about 12.6%, and real wages are declining. And of course, with wages as the major source of income for the poor and vulnerable households, a big question arises about the sustainability of all the gains in poverty and inequality reduction that took place in Brazil during the last decade at least. as you know, between 2004 and 2014, about 28.6 million people, Brazilians, managed to escape poverty, thanks to growing formal employment, higher real wages, and redistributive programs like Bolsa Familia. This is just to give you a sense of the picture, sort of the labor market. I think the more interesting part of this picture is the decline in formal job creation that you see since actually started around 2010, and it sort of continued down now to the negative. We have negative job destruction. So there's very little in terms of employment out there, and of course unemployment rate has been increasing, and labor force in terms of the number of people has been generally increasing, but what happens to labor force participation rate during the crisis is a big question. We don't know yet. Now, this gives you a sense of the progress in poverty and inequality reduction in Brazil. As you can see, the green bar is the Gini coefficient, and the inequality in general has been declining constantly since 2004 until 2014, but then in 2015 it's stayed about the same as in 2014. And the same thing with poverty and extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is the blue line. As you can see, it reached sort of the bottom at 2.8%, and started increasing now in 2015, and the same thing with the poverty rate overall in Brazil. So the question is, what's going to happen as in the next, in 2016 and 2017? The problem is there's no data available out there to let us measure what's happening to poverty. I mean, you can see unemployment increasing, but what's happening to poverty is another is a question. Now that's essentially the purpose of this work. Oh, one more thing I wanted to show here is that when you decompose what are the sources of poverty reduction during the good years, let's say 2004 to 2014, what comes out is that when you use the 140 reais poverty line, you find that the labor income is the major source of the decline in the major sort of explanatory variable for the decline in poverty. But when you focus on the extreme poverty rate, what you find is that non-labor income, which is what PNADE, where Bolsa Familia transfers sort of are captured through in the PNADE survey, non-labor income is the primary source of the reduction in the poverty rate. So again, all this to show that with the current reduction with the current situation of the labor markets in Brazil, there's some serious threats to the sustainability of poverty reduction efforts. So this is what this work is doing, and essentially we're trying to answer three different questions. What are the impacts on poverty and inequality indicators in 2016 and 2017? And what is the profile of the poor? And then we do this additional exercise of what is the additional budget for Bolsa Familia if it were to be increased in order to mitigate the negative effects of the crisis. Now, by the way, in addition to this PowerPoint, there's a policy note that has more details about this exercise that we carried through, and these are the links which that they can be accessed through. So how did we do that? How did we do these sort of estimates of what the impact of the crisis is on poverty and inequality? Well, we use what we call a micro-simulation model, which basically links changes in aggregate economic variables with distribution of income at the household level. So basically, we use microdata from the PNAD 2015 to distribute the impacts of these aggregate variables that macroeconomists typically predict. So we use 2015 as a baseline that allows us to estimate sort of how the economy works. So we use the 2015 to estimate an occupational choice model. Basically, what determines in which sector you're working, or whether you are unemployed, or whether you are out of the labor force, and an earnings equation. So we estimate the parameters of these sort of characterizing behavior in the PNAD, if you like, through these equations in 2015. And then, based on predictions about the macro variables, key macro variables, not every macro variable, based on predictions that are coming from macroeconomists, we, the parameters that we estimate on the baseline data in 2015, we re-estimate, if you like, the sector that somebody is going to be, whether they will continue working, or whether they will drop out of the labor force, or whether they will become unemployed. And then we re-estimate again their earnings. So we get a new distribution of earnings based on these predicted values of the macroeconomic variables. And we do that actually for two scenarios. Scenario 1 and scenario 2. One is closer to reality. The other one is a bit more pessimistic scenario. So we'll discuss it in more detail. So basically, that's the idea. We see what predictions the press and sort of wise macroeconomists give about GDP growth or employment growth in 2016 or 17, and then we distribute these aggregate sort of changes to the population based on the parameters that we estimate from the 2015 PNAD. And then we can get the estimates on poverty and inequality and income. Now, by the way, I mean, the microsimulation model that we're using is actually a packaged model, in a work done by the bank. So it's a downloadable that you can actually use it yourself for any other kind of simulation. And all the technical details are described in there, all the assumptions, etc. So so I'm not going to get into the technical details of these, but basically, again, this slide here summarizes the steps: the baseline data, the scenario 1 and scenario 2, and then how we estimate changes in employment. Because for this model to work, what you need is change in employment. You cannot use change in GDP in manufacturing or in agriculture. What you need is change in employment in manufacturing or in agriculture, if these are the sectors that you're interested in. So you need to translate the change in GDP to a change in employment using some approach, employment output elasticity in our case. You need to make some assumptions about the labor force participation rate. And in this model, or in this software, or the way we arranged it is that the change in unemployment is derived as a residual. You can also take into account population growth rates. And then you work out all these exercises for the different scenarios.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So it seems like the labor force participation rate is constant, but in Brazil, the labor force participation has declined a lot amongst especially among the younger guys, and now it's starting to increase a little bit. So it seems that it reacts to the cycle as well. So how important is this assumption of maintaining the labor force participation?
It's very important. So we have done different exercises with these assumptions about the labor force participation rate. Maybe it's not complete here, but in this particular exercise that I'm presenting today, labor force is assumed to be constant. Labor force participation rate is assumed to be constant. because at the time when we were carrying out this exercise, which was actually in 2016, or July or so, there was no clear indications about what's happening in the labor force participation rate. And we tried to get inferences from historic data, and I will show you some things, for example. Okay, so what are some of the key assumptions? Well, the most important one is that we're assuming a stable structural relationship between outputs, labor demand, and labor earnings, because we're using 2015 parameters, but maybe the crisis has resulted in a dramatic change in how labor markets and behavior works during the crisis period. So we just used whatever we get from the 2015 PNADE. We also assume there's no geographic mobility of factors, or labor or capital, and no general equilibrium effects in terms of resulting from our sort of occupational changes. And here we're working with prices are held constant, so we work with real values. Now, the poverty lines that we are using are the Bolsa Familia, because there's no official poverty line in Brazil, we're using the Bolsa Familia administrative poverty lines, which we adjust for inflation depending on the year you look at. So that's the extreme poverty line, the moderate poverty line, and we use also the vulnerability poverty line, which translate to this many reais in 2015. Okay, so again, just very few details about the occupational choice model. It's essentially a multinomial logic model that allows you to determine, characterize the choice among a few sectors. The sectors are out of the labor force, unemployment, manufacturing, agriculture, and services. So it's 5 different alternatives. The problem is, you know, a multinomial budget model actually it doesn't work computationally if you start having many more alternatives. So 5 is at most, I think, the number that you can use. So this model is, you estimate this multinomial model, you get the parameters of the multinomial model, and these are the ones that essentially determine which sector you're going to be in. And in addition, you have an error term that you can choose from a distribution values for this error term. This is originally a model, this particular occupational model was something developed originally by Bourguignon and Ferreira for Brazil also, specifically. And we have an earnings function, which describes conditional on working in a sector, in a specific sector, how your household characteristics correlate with earnings. And we do that separately. This earnings model is estimated separately for skilled and unskilled workers. So, to get an idea, once you come to 2016 or 2017, you apply the parameters of the multinomial model, you reassign people across sectors based on the value of the dependent variable. In this particular case, it's utility. And based on the new sector they're going to get corresponding earnings from this function here. And then you get the full new income distribution after reassignment to the different sectors.
So one of the options is inactive. So coming back to the labor force participation. So if the changes make more people become inactive, would this change the labor force participation?
Well, okay, I'll show you what. You have, so these are the GDP projections, first of all. This is basically the macro part of the model where we borrow numbers from macroeconomists, or good ones, I hope. So basically, in 2016, in this scenario here, GDP goes down 3.4%. Turns out that's not such a bad value. It came out that as of yesterday or Tuesday that GDP went down 3.6%. right? And then these are predictions about GDP in the different sectors. And then these are predictions about 2017. Now, as you can see, everything here is positive. Is everything going to be positive in 2017? Is the GDP going to increase overall by 0.5%? And agriculture, manufacturing, and services are going to increase? So anyway, that's what this scenario does. And then we do another scenario which actually uses different values for 2017. It's a bit more pessimistic. It gives -1 growth in GDP, and then I'll show you the numbers later. Now, what about, as I said, GDP in the different sectors is not enough. The model needs to have employment in the different sectors. So we need to translate GDP in a sector, GDP change in the sector, to employment change in GDP, into employment rate, level of employment in the different sectors. And again, it's an arbitrary exercise to some extent. We use employment output elasticities using some judgment about, we don't take these elasticities blindly, because as you know, when you calculate elasticities based on historical data, you can get many, many different, depending on the years you choose, you can get many different numbers. So we assume an employment output elasticity for agriculture, which is very low, 0.01%. And manufacturing is 0.69, and services 1.16. And these elasticities translate, because we know what GDP is going to change, how it's going to change in this sector, translate to these employment changes in these sectors. So these employment in millions, these are total numbers, okay, in these sectors. So now you have the aggregate numbers of the people who are going to be employed based on this exercise in these different sectors. And then that's what our model does. Then it distributes these aggregate numbers to the population of the PNAD. But to get to your question, now you have employment, which we already determined. You have labor force participation, or people out of the labor force, and then you have unemployment rate, unemployment. The sum of these three is the total population, right? So one of the variables has to be determined as a residual. What we do is we we let unemployment to be the residual, and we assume that the labor force participation rate stays constant. Now, in previous exercises that we did, in fact, we assumed a slight increase in the labor force participation rate. Now, and just to show you something here. This is, for example, this is one component of the labor force participation rate. This is the added worker effect in Brazil. When you look at historically, what happens to women when their spouse loses their job? Do they enter the labor force, yes or not? That would be a sort of an indicator, some indicator, not a complete indicator, of what may happen to the labor force when the economy goes down, economic activity goes down. Well, in general, what you can see here is that there's an inverse relationship between GDP growth and added worker effects. When GDP growth goes down, women join the labor force when their husband or their spouse loses their job. And that becomes, it's actually very nicely illustrated here. In the crisis between 2008 and 2009, you have a decline in GDP, the growth rate of GDP, and you have women flooding, if you like, entering the labor force. And the same thing in 2010. Again, you have this inverse relationship. But now, what happens? Can we use the past as a predictor about what happens to Brazil in the crisis of 2015 and 16? Well, all indications are that, labor force is not going to increase, for sure, almost for sure. So what we know from the past is not going to happen here. Again, this is an example of the discouraged worker effects. In the previous crisis, women enter the labor force because there were some jobs out there. There was some optimism, at least, that there's going to be something for them to do when they enter the labor market. Now, it seems there's no such indication. So labor force, as I said, we kept it constant, and we determined, so because we've determined employment and labor force, unemployment overall turns out to be, is estimated as a residuals. So here are the scenarios. That's the one that is sort of more closer to reality, and that's the more pessimistic scenario, scenario 2, where basically everything continues to be negative growth in all the different sectors. And unemployment rate on the aggregate is higher. All right, so these are the macro assumptions, and then you estimate them in 2015, and then you redo the exercises with these new sort of predicted values about employment in 2016 and 17 to get a new distribution. So what do we see here? What is the profile of the new unemployed under scenario 1? Well, first of all, people will become unemployed irrespective of their income levels. At least, if you believe the model, that's what the model says. So even rich people are going to, some of the rich people are going to lose their jobs. They're going to become unemployed. And this sort of decomposes where are these new unemployed coming from which different sectors. All right? Yes, and a good chunk of these new unemployed coming from the outside the labor force, the new entrants. So, what about the impacts on poverty and inequality in 2016 and 2017? Well, this is what you get. What you get is that extreme poverty will go up. Again, not much of a surprise there. And it will go up from 3.4% to 4.2%, about an increase in the number of extreme poor by 1.7 million people. On the other hand, if you use the 140 reais poverty line, the increase in poverty will be greater. It's about 2.5 million people will be the new poor, will enter the poverty pool. And of course, how big the increase in poverty is going to be depends on which scenario you're using. In a more pessimistic scenario, you get bigger increases in in poverty at the 140 poverty line. Whereas with the headcount rate here, what you see is that it stays roughly the same. The extreme poverty rate stays roughly the same in scenario 1. Yes?
But in the previous slides, you said extreme poverty, people in the extreme poverty line are less dependent on income, on non-labor income, so.
I'm more dependent on non-labor income.
More dependent, yeah, exactly, so less dependent on income, which means that they won't be as poor, I mean, they won't increase as much as other groups, because,
Well, okay, remember, these poverty rates are going to be basically from new people falling below this poverty line. It's not so much what happens to those who are already below the poverty line, but it's about what happens to those who are above the poverty line after the crisis. And that's essentially the point we're trying to make in this note, that there's going to be a number of people who are going to lose their jobs, but these people actually are not going to have, because they were previously not eligible for Bolsa Familia, they are not going to have Bolsa Familia as a support, right? And that's the whole purpose of this exercise, that maybe we should increase the budget of Bolsa Familia to cover this new poor, if you like. So now here, basically we go and break down these changes in poverty rates by different sort of characteristics. In this case, urban, rural. And what you see here is that what you see here is that poverty rates will not go up so much in the rural areas, and they will go up more in the urban areas. And again, it depends on the scenario. And it will be equally distributed more or less across regions. There's no noticeable sort of effect on increase in the poverty rate, let's say in the Northeast. The poverty rate is already high in the Northeast. There isn't going to be much of an increase in the Northeast. Now, this is the same sort of estimates. Instead of giving poverty rates, we give number of poor people. This is what the press likes. They like numbers of poor people. They don't like poverty rates. And then the same thing by region. And this is what happens to inequality. And again, what you see here in scenario 1, inequality, if you use the Gini index, will go up in 2016 and it will stay roughly the same in 2017. But in scenario 2, it will keep increasing. And that's true no matter what inequality measure you use. All right, so the next question we look at is the profile of the new poor. So what are the characteristics of these individuals who fall below the poverty line under the different scenarios, and depending on what the poverty line is. So again, this is a quick summary. The new poor are typically, and what we do is we compare these people who enter the poverty pool compared to the ones who stay in the poverty pool, who were in the poverty pool in 2015 and continue being in the poverty pool in 2016 and 17. If you like, these are the structurally poor households. All right? So the new poor are typically younger than the structurally poor. They're more skilled. More of them are white than the structurally poor. Most of them previously worked in the service sector. There are more of them in the urban areas. And more of them actually are in the southeast, from the southeast region. So this slide here sort of summarizes all these other slides that I'm showing you. But I think what is interesting to look at is that you can also ask, okay, what's the previous income decile of those who become poor in 2016 or 2017? What was their income decile in 2015, in the baseline? And what you see is that between the first and second decile, the bottom, there isn't much of a there isn't much of a change in terms of where people are coming from. The most of the new poor are coming above the second or third decile. So they're coming from higher levels of income than Bolsa Familia is currently covering, right? Which again reinforces the point that a lot of the new poor are not going to have access to the Bolsa Familia transfer unless the budget of Bolsa Familia is expanded. And again, this shows you, again, these are based on our simulations, what happens to the income, to the non-labor income of those at the bottom 1% of the population. And what it shows is that in 2016, the people that are down at the bottom 1%, based on our exercises, nobody reports receiving non-labor income. That means, based on our calculations, nobody of these at the bottom 1 percentile of the distribution is receiving Bolsa Familia in 2016. Because nobody means 2%, again, a very small number. And the same thing here in 2017. So these people are people who were not receiving any Bolsa Familia before the crisis started. And this is actually an even more detailed picture that's not based on our simulation. Now, this is based on 2014 versus 2015 PNAD. These are actual data from 2014 and 2015 PNAD. You have the bottom decile of the population, and then what we do is, this is the income change, right? This is a growth incidence curve, by the way, so, sort of. We take the bottom decile, and we break that into deciles in more detail. And then we ask where, for these people down here, where, what's the change in their income between 2014 and 2015 by source? This is labor income, non-labor income, transfers in capital, and total per capita income. And what you see is that, at least for the very bottom of the 2015 PNAD, there's the percentage of the households reporting non-labor income, which is this blue bar, is actually quite a lot. So even in 2015, in other words, with the PNAD, you can start seeing that a lot of these households are not, well, these are not the same households, first of all, right? These are different cross-sections, right, 2014 and 2015. But what you see is that the reporting of non-labor income among households in 2014 and 2015 goes down a lot. And much more, and this is nominal income, so it's much more than the 6% decline that took place because of inflation rate. So over and above what you, so again, this reinforces the point that something's going on at the bottom in terms of non-labor income, and that is already, you can actually start seeing that with the PNAD in 2015. And what we get with our simulations in 2016 and 17 is pretty much reinforcing that point. Okay, so here we just have, I'm not going to spend much time on it, but we just have transition matrices. You know, if you classify people where they were in 2015, where are they going to be in 2016? And we're using these ranges of income here. What you see is that no matter what scenario you look at, most of the people move down the income scale. There were a higher point before, a lower point in the income scale after. So most of the people become poor, and the majority of those who become poor in 2016, or in the same, next slide is in 2017, are people who are above the Bolsa Familia threshold of 140. That's in 2017 again, same story. And I think there are some people that actually move up the scale. It's not like the model works only one way. There are some people who become better off, but it's a very small number. Okay, I don't think, I mean, just to save time, I don't think that's very useful. Okay, and this is, I've already talked about this. This is a comparison of the age of the household head among the new poor, the structurally poor, and the non-poor. And that's why we say that the new poor are going to be a little bit younger than the structurally poor. They're going to, there's not going to be difference in their gender, but they'll be more skilled than the structurally poor. Which, in a way, it's an optimistic message, because that means when the crisis goes away, eventually these people will be more likely to be re-employed, because they already have skills. The problem about employment or skills is for the structurally poor. These people usually have they lack the skills to be re-employed in the market. And the profile of the new poor, okay, mostly are coming from the services. That's the gray part of these bars. And a few more of them are white and in the urban areas. And region mainly from the southeast. That's the green sort of section of the bar. So that sort of closes the section on what's the profile of the new poor. And now I'll get to the last question, which is, how am I doing in terms of time?
We have 7 minutes.
Well, it would be 10. So the third question is about how much additional budget of Bolsa Familia would be needed to mitigate the impacts. So basically, the current budget of the Bolsa Familia as of 2015 is about 26.4 billion reais. That may sound like a big number, but remember, Bolsa Familia is only 0.05% of the GDP. So it's a trivial amount in terms of overall budget or expenditure from the government side. So we assume basically that Bolsa Familia keeps operating and applies the same rules of operation as it does right now. It's just that it's able to cover, to give benefits to the new people as long as they are, to the new poor, as long as they are eligible based on the rules of the program that allow the program to cover. And again, one of the important thing here is that we keep prices constant. So we're talking about real prices here. So another way of saying is that we implicitly assume that the budget of Bolsa Familia in this exercise here adjusts with inflation perfectly. If inflation is 5.3%, the budget of Bolsa Familia adjusts by 5.3% to maintain the purchasing value of the benefit constant. Okay, so these are the details about how we do that, and we allow people to graduate out of Bolsa Familia because, as I said, some people will become better off, most people will become worse off, and then they will need money, and this is how much money will be needed to cover them based on the rules of operation of Bolsa Familia, and that's how we estimate the budget. The thing to keep in mind here is that Bolsa Familia provides benefits at the family level. It's not at the individual level. So here we have numbers that are families, right, or households. And what we get is about the marginal change in the Bolsa Familia budget under scenario 1 in 2016 is about 1 billion reais. Again, think about it, it's actually trivial in terms of how much additional budget is needed. Of course, Brazil is in the middle of a fiscal retrenchment, so it doesn't seem that anybody is thinking about increasing the budget for anything. They're just thinking of how can we cut budget from anything. And to a large extent, this is what we are the message we're trying to communicate here, that it makes absolute sense to increase the budget of Bolsa Familia. So in scenario 1 in 2017, you need about an additional 1.25 billion reais. So let me just sort of get to this, which is what you see is that what are going to be the poverty rates if you don't expand Bolsa Familia, and I've already talked about them, and what are the poverty rates if you do expand the budget for Bolsa Familia. And what you see here is this is no additional Bolsa Familia budget. This is the numbers I showed you in the previous slides. And here is what happens to the extreme poverty rate if you expand the Bolsa Familia budget. And it turns out that practically the extreme poverty rate stays exactly the same. The 140 poverty rate goes up, again, because of the way Bolsa Familia operates. Bolsa Familia always makes sure that it covers, if you're below the $70 real, and it makes sure that you always get something to cover the gap. So you always get a minimum 70 reais as a benefit. And that's why the extreme poverty rate stays the same. here, how much money you get simply depends on your household composition and the age of your children. And that is not enough to make you above the poverty line. And therefore, poverty actually increases. But not as much as without having Bolsa Familia. So, in essence, Bolsa Familia turns out to be a very effective, the way it sort of operates, a very effective way of targeting scarce resources to the households that need it the most. That means the extreme poor. And here you can get a sense of of how the income distribution changes, if you don't have the Bolsa Familia transfer and if you do have the Bolsa Familia transfer. And what you see is that for people below the 70, the extreme poverty line, it's almost like targeting is perfect. This is where your income is, poverty increases in 2017 if you didn't expand Bolsa Familia budget. If you do expand Bolsa Familia budget, it puts you back to shifts you back to the red line, which is what you were before the crisis. But for those above, between the R70 and the 140 poverty line, the shift is not complete. And that's why poverty rate in general increases when you use the 140 poverty line. But for the extreme poor, it's a perfect target. So I will finish here by basically saying that the opportunity to expand the role of the Bolsa Familia program also provides an effective way to move towards a true safety net program. So far, Bolsa Familia has been considered as a redistribution program, which basically, it's a means to transfer money from the rich to the poor. But the fact is that Bolsa Familia can also play a role of a safety net in the sense that it gives money to people who need it. And of course, these people, when they graduate out of the program, when the economy picks up, they don't have to be, they don't need to continue being beneficiaries. So it provides a safety net. And the additional budget is actually trivial and a very effective way. And one may ask, where would this money come from? And I think that picture says it all, which is, this is sort of a helicopter view of all the spending of the government that is pro-rich and pro-poor. And Bolsa Familia falls in here. And the budget that is needed for Bolsa Familia is the additional budget that is needed for expanding Bolsa Familia is actually, as I said, trivial. There's a lot of spending taking place that is favoring that is pro-rich, favoring people who don't necessarily need the resources, and especially these so-called tax expenditures or gastos tributarios. Bolsa Empresario, for example. Bolsa Empresario is a perfect example of that. So the point is, even though fiscal budget is scarce, reallocation of the budget towards certain programs still makes a lot of sense, and it will have a lot of impact on, positive impact on poverty alleviation. So I will stop here.
Okay. Thanks very much, Emmanuel. Now we have Ricardo Barros, today, going to make some comments. Thank you.
I think I can comment from here.
Go.
Okay. So thanks, Emmanuel. We have been talking about this stuff for a while. So let me make maybe 3 types of comments. I would start saying that I essentially agree on everything that Emmanuel presents here. Maybe there is one small exception that, and I may disagree a little bit on the emphasis on increasing or reorganizing expenditures things of this sort. But from the whole exercise, okay. So starting from the whole exercise, I think what's important here and was not completely clear from the presentation to me is that, it's how we connect the, and it's always the hard part, how you connect this micro simulation model with the macro scenario, okay? Okay, we have this micro model here that's very clear, and we have this macro scenario that the GDP of Brazil is going down by 3.5%. How we connect these two things. And Emmanuel was very clear about how this translates into employment. Okay, so he showed that the employment in services will go down a lot, and that will generate, if labor force participation is constant, will generate a lot of unemployment. For poverty, actually, it doesn't matter if the guy is unemployed or out of the labor force, the income is zero anyway. So if we call it out of the labor force or unemployment, it really doesn't matter much. For the poverty and inequality stuff, may matter a lot in terms of the functioning of the labor market, because if you have a large unemployment rate, can put a pressure on wages. If everybody is out of the labor force, may have less pressure on wages. It's not clear. But what's unclear to me is how wages are going to respond to this increase in unemployment. Because as we lose all these jobs, firms will look, well, there's a lot of people unemployed out there. Why should I pay the same wages? Why not give the inflation increase on my workers, so real wages may go down. And it's not clear to me that in this model here we get a decline in real wages. But if we have a decline in real wages, even the employed people will suffer. So the question is, every time we have this decline in the, every time we have this macroeconomic shock, we have to translate this into reduction in employment and reduction in wages. And if we make the adjustment all in employment, is the worst case. Because if we make all the adjustment in employment and no adjustment in wages, everybody that remains employed will not suffer at all. And the other guys will lose their job and their income will go from whatever to zero. So it's the most unequal way to adjust to a crisis, is to adjust everything on employment and nothing on wages. The other thing that you can do is say, well, all workers will accept a 3% reduction in wages, and please do not affect employment. So we keep the income share of workers the same, but we accept reduction on working hours, or we accept a decline in the wages per hour, so that nobody will lose their job. We reduce wages, and then the impact on poverty and inequality will be much smaller, because we are going to socialize more broadly the adjustment, because all workers will suffer 3% reduction. So it's not clear from this model how wages were affected. And if wages not affected at all, then, of course, the impact on poverty and inequality will be relatively smaller. Okay? So in terms of the model itself, I think what's need to be clarified, and it's how wages are affected by this macro adjustment. Okay? In terms of the substantive issues. I could not agree more with Emmanuel that to cope for Brazil, to cope with this kind of recession, in terms of poverty, and in terms of extreme poverty, it's a completely ridiculous issue, because a country that has already only 3-4% of the population below the extreme poverty line. Okay, so so one day, so when people in the government ask me, I mean, is it possible to deal with this crisis without any increase in extreme poverty? And the answer is, I mean, you guys have to do a lot for not being able to deal with the extreme poverty, because it's a completely trivial issue. Why it's so trivial? Well, it's so trivial because, I mean, in the past, Brazil had 15% of people below the extreme poverty line, then it's a big issue. Now we have 3%, 4%. So if you have a country where 4% of the population is below the extreme poverty line, and say, well, 4% of the population below the poverty line. But if the people that's below the poverty line, if you are dealing with a very equal country, 3% below the poverty line may be close to the average, because it's a very equal country. So these people can have a substantial level of income. But that's not the case of Brazil. Brazil, it's a country where we're able, and it's a very difficult to understand arithmetic question, that we have a country that is extremely unequal, but they have only 3 or 4% of the population below the extreme poverty line. Because it's a really unequal country, but relatively rich. So if you are unequal and rich, you can combine inequality with low levels of extreme poverty. And that's the case for Brazil. But if you are a very unequal family, and you only have one guy that's poor, and it comes a crisis, it's very easy to deal with the extreme poor. You say, guy, you are so poor. I mean, a 3% decline in the national income? Are we going with a 3% decline in national income? We're going to affect these guys that are extreme poor relative to us that we are extremely rich? I mean, we say, guy, your income is guaranteed, and we are going to incorporate all the crisis on our income. Okay? So why, what's the arithmetics on this? The bottom, the income of the poor in Brazil, it's 1/4 of 1%. So you're saying, it's 0.25% of the national income is the income of the extreme poor in Brazil. And that's about 1 billion reais. So the income of the extreme poor in Brazil, it's 1 billion reais. So if I have a country where the income of the extreme poor, okay, it's close to 1 billion or 2 billion reais. If any crisis will double that, well, the only thing I need is 1 billion or 2 billion reais. And that's what Emmanuel said. Well, we got you guys. You need 1 billion reais. Okay. Okay, we need 1 billion reais. I agree, I mean, we can do the calculation in different ways and so on, but I doubt, since the income of all extreme poor today, it's around 1 billion, 2 billion reais. Okay? Even if we double extreme poverty in Brazil, will cost 1 billion, 2 billion reais. Okay? So we are talking about, I mean, you can do any calculation you wish. You are going to come up with a number between 1 billion and 2 billion reais, and I'm very glad that Emmanuel come with this number, okay? You can do the calculations to know if it's 1.5, 1.75, 1.25, 1.9. It will be a number between 1 and 2 billion because the arithmetics will tell you that will be between 1 and 2 billion. It cannot be higher than that, okay? It's a simple thing. Well, but you are in a country where the amount that the government transfers, monetary transfers, what's the size of the total monetary transfers of the government to the working age population in the country? Okay? The government is transferring income to the working age population in the country. It's 120 billion per year. So the government is transferring 120 billion reais. This is monetary transfers to the working age population. And you say, well, we may have a crisis and it will cost 2 billion. Who cares? I mean, Bolsa Familia is 25 billion, 27 billion, 28 billion people. I mean, not even the government can be sure if it's 28 or 29. They are uncertain about more or less 1 billion. They are not precise about 1 billion above or below. I mean, you're talking about 1 billion. So this is not even in the treasurer have a hard time to figure out if the Bolsa Familia is 28 or 29 billion this year. So if you have a country where to eliminate all poverty, you need 2 billion, and you have a Bolsa Familia that's 25 billion, it must be badly targeted. So if you only need 2 billion, and you are spending 25 billion, why are you asking for an extra billion? So one thing that I would kind of disagree with Emmanuel, if he's saying you need extra 1 billion, I say no. I need I need to improve my targeting, because if I spending 25 billion with Bolsa Familia, of course this money is not going to the very poor. This money is going to somebody else. So just a question is, who is not poor that's receiving the Bolsa Familia, take the money from this guy and give to the poor? I will have much more than 1 billion, and it's not hard to discover who those guys are, okay? So if the government, and the government is doing that right now, right, is doing extra efforts to improve targeting, will certainly get extra money to cover this gap. So the point is, even a very profound economic crisis like what we have today in Brazil, okay, because we are so unequal, and because we have this gigantic safety net in place, it's absolutely trivial to ensure that our poor will not suffer. To do that, we have to be, the only thing we need is information about who is really poor, to make sure that our enemy is not the lack of money. Our enemy is a lack of information. We need to know who is the guy that needs the money, because to give the money to those people is ridiculous, because it would cost 500 reais per poor per year. And I mean, if this is 2 million people, this would cost R$1 billion per year, and that's a trivial amount. So tell me who are the guys, and I'll give the money, because it's very easy. Just I mean, the students' credit. What's the name of the credit?
Yes.
FIES, it's 17 billion, 15 billion, 12 billion, I mean, 1 billion. It's ridiculous. Okay? Just to give you an idea, which country is this? The bottom 40%, not the bottom 3%, but the bottom 40% of the Brazilian population, they have 10% of the national income. So, and the top 10% have something like half of the national income. So if so the country is so unequal that if you have an unequal country that wants to be to have solidarity with the poor, it becomes a trivial exercise. So if I have a very unequal family that want to help the poor, then becomes very trivial to help the poor. Once you decided, the point is, why a very unequal society wants to be solidary with the poor. But after you decided that you want to do that, and that's what Brazil did over the past 10 years, you built a gigantic safety net, and we did, and the safety net consumes 120 billion reais per year, and that's not going to Social Security, that just transfers from the government to the workers in the country. It's 120 billion. To move 1 billion to help the extreme poor, it's just a matter of knowing who they are. So, and to put extra 1 billion in the Bolsa Familia without knowing who they are will not help either, right? So the point is the great negative characteristic of Brazil, which is the huge inequality. It's actually a great asset in the time of a crisis. If I have decided already on the solidarity, right? And Brazil did both, continues to be extremely unequal and decided to be very kind with the poor. And in this case, it's very easy to do as long as you are able to know who they are. So, Manuel, thanks, and that's essentially my comments, and I think if you can clarify exactly how wages are sensitive to the crisis would be great.
Yeah, in fact, I should have clarified that wages adjust with the change in GDP. If GDP increases, the wage bill, if you like, adjusts by the same percentage, and vice versa. If GDP declines, which we have in scenario 1 in 2016, the wages also adjust.
But the wage, the total
income,
the total income of the workers, but you have a decline in employment. That's probably greater than you get employment elasticities above 1, probably. So the total wage bill can decline, but since the employment is declining even by more than the GDP, maybe wages are even going up. Wages per worker. The question is, what's going on with the wages per worker?
Yeah, I will definitely look into this and try to make it clear. Now, I think I had one last thing on the issue you raised about targeting. I mean, targeting is yeah, it's an information problem, of course. You know, who are the you know, identifying who is the poor. But I think in the context now of well, the political context for Brazil is to sort of bring in the question of targeting to identify who is truly poor versus who declares poor. I mean, I don't know if that's doing a service. The fact is, in general, targeting is an imperfect exercise. There's always targeting errors. The question is where these errors are these errors very serious? Or are these errors less serious? I mean, are the people that you are sort of misplacing, are they closer to your eligibility thresholds, yes or no? And I know you have been working on these things. But in a way, I think in terms of political economy, in a time of crisis, to actually say, well, we can get the funds for Bolsa Familia, for the additional poor, let's say, of the Bolsa Familia by perfecting the targeting of Bolsa Familia. Certainly one can do that, but it certainly creates a precedent that may not be good for the future. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's you guys know the political economy here more. To me, it always makes sense to work with the assumption that targeting is an imperfect exercise, and you need to make errors for political economy reasons, so that you can have buy-off of the program by you know, political acceptability of the program by the people who are not in reality should be receiving the benefits of the program. So in general, targeting errors are a price you pay to buy middle class support, if you like, for the transfer of resources to the poor.
In which way? I'm not sure.
Well, you know, if people from the middle class, for example, for one reason or another manage to get Bolsa Familia benefits because they underdeclare their income, and then Bolsa Familia doesn't necessarily go after them.
But the other guys that are not receiving would not like that. So
yeah.
So you have support from one side, and
what
then
the
you have
government
people
did
against the other
now,
side.
what the government did now that was very smart, I guess, was to say, let's improve targeting and improve the value of the benefit for the real poor. And my guess is the middle class would like the program to be well targeted, because a program that could cost 5 billion, it's costing 25 billion. It's something deeply wrong.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't see they like the program not to be well targeted. I think they have other ways of evasion, tax evasion, and other ways of getting more money than
From other sources, yeah.
But it seems like the number of beneficiaries is declining a lot. At least I heard from the news. So you're improving the targeting, but my intuition is that you're having difficulties to put new people in the program, because those guys that are
they put a lot of people in. I mean,
Yeah.
New people.
They broke the record of bringing new people in, but they put so many people out that they can. There's no. I mean, Bolsa Familia typically used to have a queue, people that have the necessary requirements and are not beneficiaries because of budget constraint. Now there is no queue. Everybody that actually have the income below the threshold is in the program. How they did that? By taking a bunch of guys that were not supposed to be in the program out. So if you clean your files, you can take so many people out that you can put everybody that and still reduce the number, because if the country has 3% of extremely poor people, I mean 3%, it's 6 million. If you have 6 million people extremely poor, or if you have 8 million people extremely poor, and you have 50 million people in Bolsa Familia, there's something wrong. I mean, 50 million people, and you get 8 million, I mean, something is deeply wrong. I mean,
So let's have some questions from the audience. Does anyone want to raise a question about the presentation or an additional question?
So the new picture now, it's even more as bad because we have more skilled people on the new group. So I was just wondering about your occupation model. Does it account for congestion effect? So if you have more skilled people looking for jobs and labor demand is declining or even constant, so you have more, all those people that get more job offers, they will be competing for jobs. And then maybe you don't get much this new, let's say, picture of having more skilled people in the new group. So it might not be as easy for them to get back to labor force.
Yeah,
Back to work.
in fact, that's a question I asked Naircio, whether there's any literature on the re-employment, if you like, likelihood of skilled people being losing their job. At least historically, I don't know if there's any work on that done in Brazil, but I think that would be, it's more of a research question that needs to be addressed. Because it relates a lot to, okay, what's going to happen when things pick up in the economy? Are these people, immediately going to get a job later on, and they were previously employed, and now they're going to have to compete with new entrants or new graduates. I would, what my first reaction would be, an employer would more likely hire these guys who have some working experience before. But the extent to which your unemployment is like a stigma of some sort, then it may work the other way around. I don't know. So then that sort of creates a drain on the Bolsa Familia budget, because these guys are just going to have to stay there longer. I don't know the answers to these questions, but that certainly falls along your lines of work. So.
Any more questions?
Supposing that volunteers from the big do not apply, would you recommend something like cuts on the budget surplus target to deal with this kind of situation, to increase the budget of Bolsa Familia and not apply this to the surplus of the government?
Or the overall fiscal surplus, you mean that
Yeah.
spending cap that you.
Yeah.
But I think it's a trivial number, so I don't think it's going to matter at all.
Yes, 1-2 billion. Yeah, any more questions? Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much
for
for your
the
comments.
interesting presentation. Thanks, Pepe, for the comments.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good to see you. So, our ego is development of Bolsa Familia. I mean, I knew that they were going to do something. Target. Doing that. Is this the same stuff that you were doing in Greece?
No. They're not doing that. They're doing simple things, like going after people that have had basic stuff.
Hi, I would like just to introduce myself. My name is Lígia from Bolsa Econômica. And yeah, I would like in the future, I'm interested in apply a lot of unemployed, like for public policies and poverty. I don't know if you have some contact I can write to you. I'm sorry, I didn't bring my card. I need to talk to you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
Thank you
you.
very much.
Hi, I'm Rafaela. I'm a public relations minister. I have a journalist interest with you a little bit. It's Fernanda from Folha de São Paulo. Do you have a little bit to talk
Sure. So, how you want to do this? Sit there or?
Yeah, it's better here. It's very informal.
This and then?
Here in
That's in Cincinnati. That's it.
in the worst scenario. The best scenario would be 2.6, right? Yeah, 2.5. In 2017 only. And 2016.
This would be too much. You want the number of poor, right? In 2000, yeah, so 16. Yeah, we go from 6.8 to 8.3.
8.3. But this is the total, it's not the increase, right?
Yeah, that's the total. So you have to subtract them to get the increase.
6.8 million in 2014.
This is how we get the 8.5 minus 6.8 is the... That's in 2017. In 2016 it will be... Journalists like
numbers, yeah.
That's our mistake. We didn't put these numbers in the report.
So then 2.5 actually is from 2015 to 2017. Actually, the increase from 2016 to 2017 is very small. It's only... So here I was hearing that the worst impact is
especially in scenario one, because in scenario one things are actually improving, right? Yeah, we always compare each year, 16 and 17, with 15, but not with 16 and 17.
And when you say that the baseline here is something like is 70 for it's 70 per person, right?
Per capita per month.
Just to make sure I got the numbers right. And when I propose that we should increase the budget to cope up with this increase, why these people aren't already fit for it? Because if they meet the requirements to
because the way, that's a question I got yesterday also. Well, because